The first time I heard the knock, I thought it was a delivery. But when I opened the door, I found 3 people standing there, dressed like they were about to host a corporate meeting instead of visiting a neighbor. The woman in front, a sharp-featured lady with a self-important air, smiled at me in a way that immediately set off alarms in my head. She was flanked by an older man with a stiff posture and a younger woman who clutched a folder like it was a shield. "Hello," the woman said, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "I'm Pamela, the president of the Lakewood Homeowners Association." She motioned to the 2 beside her. "This is Richard, our treasurer, and Monica, our community relations officer. We're here to discuss an important matter regarding your gate. My property. I already knew I wasn't going to like where this was going. Love seeing entitled people get what they deserve. Subscribe for more crazy stories like this." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I don't recall joining any HOA," I said, "and I don't think I need to discuss anything with you." Pamela let out a breathy laugh, as if I had just told a cute joke. "Oh, we know you're not a member. Your property predates our HOA's formation, so you've never been required to pay dues." However, she clasped her hands together, adopting a sympathetic tone. "We've noticed that your back gate provides the most direct access to the lake. Right now, our residents have to take the long route through the public trail, which is inconvenient for families with young children or elderly members. We'd love to work with you to make things easier for the community." I narrowed my eyes. "Are you asking me to let the entire neighborhood use my property as a shortcut?" Pamela smiled wider. "It wouldn't be a big deal for you, just a small gesture of goodwill. We'd simply need a copy of the key to your gate, so we can ensure fair access to everyone." I couldn't believe the audacity. They wanted me to hand over access to my private land, the land my father had protected, the land I had grown up on, just so a bunch of entitled HOA members wouldn't have to take an extra 15-minute walk. I shook my head. "Not happening." Pamela's smile faltered, replaced by a look of mild frustration. "We'd really prefer to resolve this amicably. After all, we're neighbors. I'm sure you don't want to appear uncooperative." I let out a dry chuckle. "You want me to give up my property rights for the sake of convenience, and if I say no, I'm the bad guy." Richard, the older man, finally spoke up. "You don't understand. We're trying to improve the neighborhood for everyone. If you don't want to be difficult about it, we could even consider waiving some of our community fees for you." I frowned. "I don't pay your fees because I'm not in your HOA." Monica cleared her throat. "Look, we don't want this to turn into an unnecessary conflict. We're just asking for a reasonable compromise." I met her gaze. "Here's my compromise, no." Pamela sighed, glancing at Richard and Monica before turning back to me. "I hoped you'd be more understanding, but I can see you're not willing to cooperate. That's unfortunate." There was something in her tone that made me uneasy, like this was just the opening move in a longer game. She handed me an official-looking envelope. "Please review this letter. We expect a response within the week." Without another word, she turned and strode away, her entourage following. I closed the door and tore open the envelope. Inside was a formal request, typed on HOA letterhead, reiterating their demand for access to my gate. The wording was just polite enough to avoid outright threats, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of pressure. They were trying to push me into submission, thinking I'd fold under their so-called authority. They didn't realize I wasn't the kind of person to back down. What I didn't know then was just how far they were willing to go. A week after the visit from the HOA, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. It began with letters in my mailbox, printed on that same official HOA letterhead. Each one had some new claim, some fabricated reason they were reminding me of my community obligations. The first one stated that my fence wasn't up to the neighborhood's guidelines and needed to be replaced to fit their uniform aesthetic. The next letter was a violation notice, saying I owed a $200 fine for refusing to comply with direct HOA orders. I tossed them in the trash without a second thought. Then the calls started. Unknown numbers leaving vague voicemails about following up on an unresolved issue. I never answered, and they never left details. Just that same tone of feigned patience layered over passive aggression. One evening, I was out back, checking the lock on my gate, when I noticed movement near the fence line. A group of people, maybe 4 or 5, were standing just beyond the property, staring at the gate and taking notes. One of them had a measuring tape. I walked over. "Can I help you?" They all jumped, clearly not expecting me. A man in a polo shirt and khaki stepped forward. "Oh, hi. I'm Dale. We're surveying the property lines for a community improvement project." I glanced at the papers in his hands. "What improvement project?" Dale hesitated. "The HOA hired us to assess possible access routes to the lake." I clenched my jaw. "On my land?" Dale looked uncomfortable. "Well, we were told there was an agreement in place that you were allowing this." "There is no agreement." His face fell. He turned to the others, muttering something before turning back to me. "I apologize. We wouldn't have come out here if we'd known. We'll leave now." I watched them pack up and head out, my fists tight at my sides. The HOA was trying to strong-arm me, hoping I'd get overwhelmed and just give in. That night, I made a few upgrades. I installed a camera facing the gate, just a small motion-activated one. I put up a sign that read "Private Property, No Trespassing." It wasn't much, but it was enough to make it clear that I wasn't playing their game. For a little while, things quieted down. No more letters, no more surveyors. I thought maybe they'd finally given up. Then, one afternoon, I came home to find a small piece of paper taped to my fence. The words scrawled across it made my stomach tighten. "You're being petty. Open the gate for the neighborhood or face the consequences." No name, no signature, just an anonymous threat. I took a deep breath, ripping the paper down. I told myself it was just a disgruntled neighbor, someone upset that they couldn't use my land like a public park. But something about it felt personal. And then little things started going missing. A gardening spade I always kept by the shed. A hose nozzle. My bird feeder was pulled from the tree and tossed into the bushes. Nothing major, but enough to feel like someone wanted me to know they'd been there. I tightened security, adding another camera and replacing the lock on the gate with a sturdier one. If they wanted to keep pushing, I'd push back. But the real fight was just getting started. It was a Saturday morning when I realized just how far the HOA was willing to go. I stepped outside with my coffee, planning to check on my garden, when I noticed something off. My gate, the lock was gone. Not broken, not forced, completely gone. In its place was a brand new lock, one that I hadn't put there. I set my coffee down and walked over, my stomach twisting. I pulled at the gate, locked tight. I crouched down, looking closer. The cut edges of my original lock were still on the ground, discarded like trash. Someone had taken bolt cutters to it. Someone had come onto my property, removed my lock, and replaced it with their own. My hands clenched into fists. I already knew who was behind it. I didn't bother with calls or letters this time. I marched straight to the front of my house, phone in hand, and dialed the non-emergency police line. I kept my voice calm, but the anger was boiling under the surface. I need an officer at my property. Someone trespassed and tampered with my gate. 15 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. The officer stepped out, a tall man with a steady gaze. "You called about trespassing." I led him around back, pointing at the new lock. "This isn't mine. My original was cut off. I have reason to believe the HOA did this." The officer crouched down, examining the lock. "Do you have proof?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the previous letters, the violation notices, and a screenshot of the threat note I had received. They've been trying to force me to open my property for their use. I refused. Now they're breaking onto my land. The officer exhaled sharply and straightened. "That's serious. Do you have any security footage?" I hesitated, The camera I put up is motion activated, but I'll check. I pulled up the footage on my app. There it was. A group of 5 people walking to the back of my property just before sunrise. One of them holding a set of bolt cutters. And leading them? Pamela. I turned the screen to the officer. His jaw tightened. That's enough to have a conversation. As if on cue, another car pulled up. Not the police, Pamela. And she wasn't alone. 3 more board members stepped out with her, walking toward me like they owned the place. Pamela smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. Good morning. I see you've noticed a new lock. I hope you understand this was a necessary step for the community. I stared at her, disbelief mixing with rage. You trespassed on my property. You cut my lock. And you think that's justified? She waved a dismissive hand. Oh, don't be so dramatic. We're just trying to make things easier for everyone. Now, we have a copy of this new key. She held up a small metal key, shaking it between her fingers. And if you'd like, we can provide you with one so you can still access the lake. The sheer audacity made my head spin. The officer stepped forward. Ma'am, you and your associates have committed trespassing and vandalism. Pamela's confident expression faltered. Excuse me? You cut off a lock and replaced it with your own without the property owner's consent. That's destruction of property. And if he chooses to press charges, you could be arrested. The color drained from her face. Wait. There must be some misunderstanding. This is a community access point. No, I said coldly. This is my land, and you don't get to decide what happens on it. The officer crossed his arms. Ma'am, I need you and your people to remove that lock immediately. Pamela turned to the others, her panic barely masked. Richard, the treasurer, pulled out a set of bolt cutters, muttering under his breath as he snapped the lock open. I took my own lock out of my pocket and reinstalled it, locking the gate with a final click. This is the last time, I said, my voice low. You come onto my property again, and I will press charges. Pamela didn't argue this time. She just turned on her heel, motioning for her board members to follow. But as she walked away, she threw one last look over her shoulder. This isn't over. I smiled. You're right. It's not. A few days passed without incident, but I knew better than to think it was over. Pamela wasn't the kind of person to back down just because she got caught. The woman had spent months trying to manipulate and intimidate me into giving her what she wanted. The moment the police left that day, I saw it in her eyes. She was already planning her next move. And I was right. It was late in the evening when I saw the first police cruiser pull up in front of my house. Then a second. My stomach tightened. I hadn't called them. I stepped outside just as 2 officers walked toward my front door. One of them I recognized. The same officer who had backed me up against Pamela's stunt with the lock. The other was younger, a fresh-faced guy who looked like he wasn't sure what he had just walked into. Mr. Carter, the older officer said, his tone laced with frustration. We received a call about an ongoing community dispute. Someone reported that you were illegally blocking a public access point. I exhaled slowly. Pamela, the younger officer, shifted, glancing at his partner. She made it sound like you were violating some kind of agreement. There is no agreement, I said firmly. This is private property. I have all the legal documentation to prove it. Again, the older officer pinched the bridge of his nose, clearly done with this nonsense. I figured, just show us the paperwork so we can officially put this to rest. I led them inside, grabbing the folder I had kept from the very beginning. Everything was in there. My deed, property lines, even the cease and desist letter my lawyer had drafted when the HOA first started harassing me. I handed it over, watching as the younger officer skimmed through the documents. He looked up, frowning. So, they have no claim here. At all. Not a single one. The older officer sighed. Thought so. Then, as if on cue, another car pulled up in front of my house. Not a police cruiser this time. Pamela. And she wasn't alone. Two other HOA board members stepped out, their arms crossed like they were about to argue a case in court. I stepped outside before she could reach the porch. Called the cops on me again. Pamela? She barely flinched at the accusation. I had no choice. You refused to cooperate, and the neighborhood is growing tired of your selfishness. It's only fair that the authorities settle this. The younger officer shot her a look. Ma'am, there's nothing to settle. This property is privately owned, and you have no legal right to demand access. Pamela's lips thinned. That land should be shared. It's a matter of community harmony. The older officer cut in, his patience clearly gone. No, it's a matter of property law. And if you continue harassing this man, you and your HOA could face legal consequences. For the first time, Pamela hesitated. She had been so sure she was in the right, so convinced that her authority over the HOA extended to me. But now, in front of officers who weren't playing her game, she had nowhere to go. Her board members shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a middle-aged man I barely recognized, muttered, "Pam, maybe we should let this go." Pamela shot him a glare, but said nothing. I folded my arms. I suggest you listen to him, because if I get one more letter, one more fake violation, one more attempt to mess with my property, I will press charges. And this time, I won't just let you walk away. For a long moment, she just stared at me, her jaw tight. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed back to her car. I watched them leave, knowing this was a moment things would start falling apart for her. And I was right. A few weeks later, I started hearing rumors. People in the HOA weren't happy. A local real estate blog had picked up on the story, running a piece about HOA overreach that detailed how a board president had wasted association funds trying to strong-arm a homeowner into compliance. It didn't name names, but everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly who it was about. Pamela's grip on the HOA started to slip. At the next board meeting, residents started asking questions. How much money had been spent hiring surveyors? Where had the funds come from for all the mailed notices? What legal grounds had there been for any of it? Pamela tried to control the damage, but the truth was out. The board members who had once stood beside her started backing away, unwilling to sink with the ship. When the next election rolled around, she was voted out. The new board president, someone younger, more level-headed, reached out to me a few weeks later. He assured me they wouldn't be bothering me again. Pamela, on the other hand, faded from sight. Some say she moved. Others say she stayed, but was never quite the same after losing her position. As for me, nothing changed.